Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks very much for coming. I'm sorry I've been separated off from you again. They usually put a little sort of dais thing down here. It makes me feel more close to you. But today I'm back here. So let's hope that the lecture doesn't feel too distant. Can everyone hear me quite clearly and comfortably? The sound is all right? Great. Okay. This is lecture number 7 on the RISSHO ANKOKU RON. Probably we have about 2 lectures to go to complete this very important thesis written by Nichiren Daishonin and entitled in English on securing peace in the land through establishing the ultimate truth. On securing peace in the land through establishing the ultimate truth. In this particular lecture, we're going to deal with the 5th and 6th questions in the dialogue that took place between Nichiren Daishonin, who plays the role of the host, and the most powerful man in Japan in those days, whose name was Hojo Tokiyori. Hojo Tokiyori was a retired regent, yet behind the scenes he held the reins of power in the government at that time. And Hojo Tokiyori acts the part of the traveler in this thesis, which is set out in the form of a dialogue. Nichiren Daishonin submitted this paper to the government of Japan on the 16th of July, 1260. So at the beginning of the thesis, right where we started many months ago, you remember the traveler, when he arrives to spend the night on his journey, is bemoaning the appalling state of Japan at that time. And his host, Nichiren Daishonin, explains to him why this situation should exist at that time. And of course it was the most terrible, or one of the most terrible periods in Japanese history. And the people really were in a very miserable and unhappy state. This was due to a continuous series of natural disasters that occurred in Japan for about 40 years, from just before the time Nichiren Daishonin was born through most of his lifetime. These were disasters such as earthquakes and floods, typhoons, epidemics of disease, famine, and all kinds of natural troubles. Since then, of course, in Japan, there have been many other disasters, culminating, perhaps, firstly, in the great disaster of what was known as the Kanto earthquake in 1923. This was the worst earthquake in Japan in recorded history, and destroyed thousands and thousands and thousands of homes and lives in the Tokyo and Yokohama area. I remember when I was in business in Japan, my office was in Yokohama, and on the top floor of it was the Greek consul. He was a very old man, and he'd lived through that great earthquake, and he was one of the few people who had photographs taken when it was actually in progress. And they were really dramatic. You could see from these photographs huge buildings literally swaying and shaking. The camera had caught them amazingly well. And he described to me the horror of that time, the feeling of complete unbelief that the whole world seemed to be rocking around you, and great buildings that seemed so solid crumbling into dust. And he also described to me the devastation afterwards, and the tragedy of the people who were homeless, and indeed the lawlessness which broke out due to a complete breakdown in supplies and people looting for food and so on. So it was really an incredible, disastrous moment in the history of Japan. Very difficult for us to visualize in this comparatively earthquake-free part of the world. And then finally, the culmination of all Japan's disasters from the time of the RISSHO ANKOKU RON was World War II. in the last year or so of World War II, every single city in Japan was bombed to pieces. The Allies began with the main cities and then spread outwards to every single other city in the entire length and breadth of Japan. So our minds tend to concentrate on the atomic bombs, which was the final stroke, and which were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. But the death and severe and serious injury from the bombing was also quite frightful. In that final and most terrible bombing, 600,000 people died or were seriously maimed and injured. These were, of course, civilians. This was in Japan itself. And no less than 3 million homes were destroyed by fire or explosives. And 10 million people were made homeless. It's very difficult, isn't it, to visualize such a situation. 10 million people homeless, living in holes in the ground or under rough shelters in the midst of absolute desolation. So, of course, one can say that these ultimate disasters in Japan occurred because Hojo Tokiyori, or the traveler in this paper called the RISSHO ANKOKU RON, refused to listen to what Nichiren Daishonin was teaching. When he sent his paper into the government, rather than even taking notice of it for a moment, they stepped up the persecution against him because he was trying to establish the ultimate truth, and this was against all the established religions and teachings in Japan. So this is a sober thought, isn't it? That these disasters occurred time and again throughout Japanese history, culminating with the greatest and the worst of all in this century in which we live. This was the karma of the Japanese people. And of course, apart from reflecting on the karma of the Japanese people, it's also good to reflect on the karma of our own people, which also contains shadows and darkness, as well as some good fortune. So what was Nichiren Daishonin trying to point out to the ruling authorities of that day in the paper called RISSHO ANKOKU RON? Firstly, he was saying that the people had been misled into following false and erroneous teachings. Particularly, he singled out a teaching called Nembutsu. Nembutsu had become the most popular religion in Japan, and millions had flocked to it. The reason, perhaps, was that it was a form of escapism in the misery that surrounded everyone in Japan in those times, in those medieval days. Nembutsu taught that there was a paradise waiting for people in what they called the pure land in the West after death. And if they chanted the Nembutsu chant of Namamida Butsu, then they would be sure to go there after they departed from this world. So this seemed to those people the only hope, I think, in those devastating times. These teachings were spread, of course, by priests and monks, and they actually distorted the teachings of the historical Buddha Shakyamuni, and even indeed denied his sutras. Therefore, the monks and the priests and all the people who followed them, which was the majority of the people in Japan, were actually committing slander against the ultimate truth or the true law. Therefore, Nichiren Daishonin went on to explain in this thesis that through the principle of Esho Funi, the inseparability of man and his environment, the people were acting in their daily lives against the true law, and therefore were totally out of rhythm with it, and even going against it. And therefore, the benevolent forces of the universe were no longer in harmony with them. Thus, he said, the Buddhist gods, or the forces of the universe, which protect human life had left the land. This was the reason, he said, for the succession of appalling natural disasters and for what are known in Buddhism, in Shakyamuni's teachings, as the 3 calamities and 7 disasters. Now, all these 3 calamities and 7 disasters, which Shakyamuni Buddha had predicted 2,000 years previously, he had predicted that these would occur if the people went against his true teaching called the Lotus Sutra. And all of them had occurred except 2. Those 2 were civil war and foreign invasion. Therefore, Nichiren Daishonin predicted with absolute conviction and certainty that these 2 disasters would occur in due course. And, of course, as many of you know, his predictions were fulfilled when civil war broke out. Very shortly after this particular thesis was written, and the Mongols began their threats against Japan a few years later and ultimately invaded the southern islands. So, because Hojo Tokiyori would not listen to Nichiren Daishonin, Japan, as I say, couldn't change its karma, and history repeated itself in the way that I've explained. Now, things are different, aren't they, in Japan? Thanks to the Soka Gakkai, the great movement which began after the war ended, when propagation of religion was freed for the first time in Japan's history, and allowed and permitted in the new constitution drawn up with the guidance of the occupying forces. For the first time, Japan could hear about Nam-myoho Renge-kyo. That is to say, on a wide scale. Of course, it had existed in the head temple for many, many years, and every so often attempts had been made to propagate it, but always this resulted in persecution. So after World War II, for the first time, propagation could begin freely and without hindrance. And as a result of this, millions of members gradually began to appear and practice in Japan, chanting Nam-myoho Renge-kyo and setting their lives in rhythm with the true law, or the law of the universe. And the results can be seen gradually appearing in Japan today and steadily over the years that have gone by since that war. The transformation in Japan is incredible now compared with the picture I tried to paint for you of the devastation that existed there at the end of the war. So at the same time as the spread of the teaching of Nam-myoho Renge-kyo in Japan, through the mercy or the merciful force, which is the force of the universe itself, always working for creation and value, the teaching of Nam-myoho Renge-kyo spread eventually from Japan overseas until today, where it's being followed in increasing numbers in 91 countries of the world. So it was through the tremendous exertions and belief and conviction of the presidents of the Soka Gakkai, the lay society in Japan, that these teachings were carried overseas and enabled to blossom and grow. At the same time, it was President Toda, the second president of the lay society, no doubt guided by the high priest of Nichiren Shoshu, who first pointed out that the tragedies and disasters that existed in medieval Japan, and for which the only remedy was for people to follow the true law, now applied to the whole world. And this situation, of course, exists to this present day. The disasters of medieval Japan are everywhere, in every corner of the globe almost. So, in accordance with the teaching of Nichiren Daishonin, just as the benevolent forces of the universe left Japan in those medieval times, so there could be a danger of those protective forces leaving the entire world in our time. This is a sobering thought, and of course should be one of the driving forces behind our great efforts to teach more and more people the truth of the law of life and to open their eyes to an understanding of that truth. So the RISSHO ANKOKU RON is still an incredibly important document, no longer just for Japan, but for the whole world. Now, fortunately, in our times, power in many countries is not in the hands of despotic rulers, as was the case in Japan in the Middle Ages. Of course, in some countries of the world, it still remains so. But in democracies where they exist, the people are in the end the sovereign power. And it is the people, therefore, who in these modern times should be awakened to the ultimate truth, and in turn awaken others to it, rather than it being necessary for the ruler of the land, such as Hojo Tokuyori, to be shakabuku'd in those days. So we are the people. We happen to be, through our good fortune, those who have heard about it first and begun to put it to the test and proved it in our daily lives. So therefore, it could be no one else but our task to open the eyes of others, our fellow people in the United Kingdom, alongside those other members of Nichiren Shoshu Soku Gakkai who live in every other country almost of the world. This is our role and purpose in life more than anything else. And this is the great purpose of the movement for the human revolution and world peace, which we call Kosen Rufu. So, like some of the people that we try to teach the law to, the traveler in this tale of Nichiren Daishonin's, this thesis, gets incredibly angry at Nichiren Daishonin's conviction. And he grows increasingly resentful as Nichiren Daishonin condemns the established order in Japan at that time. In the last lecture, we studied question and answer 4. And in that, Nichiren Daishonin was explaining to the traveler how it was that monks and priests could spread slanderous teachings and get away with it. So by the time the traveler asked the 5th and 6th questions, which is what we're going to deal with today, he was really furious, because everything that it seemed in the existing order in Japan had been condemned by Nichiren Daishonin's words. So now, having sort of got our minds back into what we're doing in these series of lectures, I'll ask Robert to read question and answer 5, which is on page 19 in the left-hand column. Page 19 in the left-hand column. Okay.
This time the guest was truly enraged and said, "In the ages since our original teacher, the Buddha Shakyamuni, preached the 3 Pure Land Sutras, the priest Tan Luan, who had originally studied the 4 treatises, abandoned them and put all his faith in the Pure Land teachings. Similarly, the priest Dao Cho ceased to spread the multifarious doctrines of the Nirvana Sutra and devoted all his attention to the practices of the Western region. The priest Shan Dao discarded the incorrect practices and concentrated on the single practice of the Pure Land. And the priest Eshin collected passages from various sutras to form his work, stressing the importance of a single practice, the Nembutsu. Such was the manner in which these men honored and respected the Buddha Amida, and uncountable numbers of persons as a result were able to gain salvation. Of particular note was the Venerable Honen, who as a child entered the monastery on Mount Hiei. By the time he was 17, he had worked his way through all 60 volumes of Tendai literature and had investigated all the 8 sects and mastered their essentials. In addition, he had read through the entire body of sutras and treatises 7 times, and exhausted all the works of exegesis and biography. His wisdom shone like the sun and moon, and his virtue exceeded that of the earlier teachers. In spite of all this, he was in doubt as to the proper path to salvation, and could not make out the true meaning of nirvana. Therefore he read and examined all the texts he could, pondered deeply, and considered every possibility, and in the end put aside all the sutras and concentrated on the single practice of the Nembutsu. In addition, he received confirmation of his decision when Shandao miraculously appeared to him in a dream, and he proceeded to spread his doctrines among friends and strangers in all 4 corners of the land. Thereafter he was hailed as a reincarnation of the Bodhisattva Seishi, or was reverenced as Shandao reborn in a new form. In every quarter, people of eminent and lowly birth alike bowed their heads in respect, and men and women from all over Japan turned their steps towards him. Since that time, the springs and autumns have succeeded each other, and the years have accumulated. And yet, you insist upon putting aside the venerable teachings of Shakyamuni Buddha contained in the Pure Land Sutras, and willfully speak evil of the writings concerning the Buddha Amida. Why do you try to blame the sacred age of Honen for the disasters of recent years, going out of your way to slander the former teachers of Pure Land doctrine, and to heap abuse on a sage like Honen? You are, as the saying goes, deliberately blowing back the fur and hunting for flaws in the leather, deliberately piercing the skin in hopes of drawing blood. From ancient times to the present, the world has never seen such a speaker of evil. You had better learn a little caution and restraint. When you pile up such grave offences, how can you hope to escape punishment? I'm afraid even to sit here in your company. I must take up my staff and be on my way. The host, smiling, restrained his guest and said, "Insects that live on smart weed forget how bitter it tastes. Those who stay long in privies forget how foul the smell is. Here you listen to my good words and think them wicked. Point to a slanderer like Honen and call him a sage. Mistrust a true teacher and take him for an evil monk. Your confusion is great indeed, and your offence anything but light. Listen to my explanation of how this confusion arose, and let us discuss the matter in detail. The doctrines that Shakyamuni preached in the course of his lifetime can be assigned to 5 distinct preaching periods. The order in which they were preached can be established, and they can be divided into provisional and true teachings. But Tan Luan, Dao Cho, and Shandao embraced the provisional teachings and forgot about the true ones, went by what had been taught in the earlier period of the Buddha's life, and discarded what was taught later. They were not the kind of men who delve into the deep places of Buddhist doctrine. Honen in particular, though he followed the practices advocated by these earlier men, was ignorant as to the source from whence they came. How do we know this? Because he lumped together all the 637 Mahayana scriptures with the 2,883 volumes of text, and along with them all the various Buddhas and Bodhisattvas and the deities of the heavenly and human worlds, and urged people to discard, close, ignore, and abandon them, offending with these 4 injunctions the hearts of all living beings. Thus he poured out perverted words of his own invention, and took absolutely no cognizance of the explanations put forth in the Buddhist scriptures. His is the worst kind of baseless talk, a clear case of slander. There are no words to describe it, no way to censure it that is too mild. And yet men all put faith in this baseless talk of his, and without exception pay honor to his Senshaku Shu. As a consequence, they revere the 3 sutras of the Pure Land and cast all the other sutras aside. They look up to one Buddha alone, Amida of the land of bliss, and forget about the other Buddhas. A man such as Honen is in truth the deadly enemy of the Buddhas and the scriptures, and the foe of sage monks and ordinary men and women alike. And now his heretical teachings have spread throughout the 8 regions of the country, They have penetrated every one of the 10 directions. You became quite horrified when I blamed an earlier period for the disasters that have occurred in recent years. Perhaps I should cite a few examples from the past to show you that you are mistaken to do so. The second volume of the Makashikan quotes a passage from the Shi-chi, or Records of the Historian, which says, "In the closing years of the Chu dynasty, there were persons who let their hair hang down, went about naked to the waist, and did not observe the rites and regulations." The Guketsu commentary on the Makashikan, in the second volume, explains this passage by quoting from the Tso Chuan as follows. "When King Ping of the Chu first moved his capital east to Loyang, he saw men by the Yi River who let their hair hang down and performed sacrifices in the fields. Someone who had great understanding said, 'In less than 100 years the dynasty will fall, for the rites are already neglected.' From this it is evident that the portent appears first, and later the disaster itself comes about." The Makashikan passage goes on to say, "Juan Xie of the West Qin dynasty was a man of extraordinary talent, but he let his hair grow like a mass of brambles and left his belt undone. Later the sons of the aristocracy all imitated him, until those who behaved in a churlish and insulting manner were thought to be acting quite naturally, and those who were restrained and proper in their behavior were ridiculed as mere peasants. This was a sign that the Suma family, the rulers of the West Qin dynasty, would meet with their downfall." Similarly, the Nito Junrei Ki, or Record of a Pilgrimage to China in Search of the Law, by Jikaku Daishi, records that in the first year of the Hui Chang era, 841, Emperor Wu Tsang of the Tang dynasty commanded the priest Qing Shuang of Changqing Temple to transmit the Nembutsu teachings of the Buddha Amida in the various temples. Qing Shuang spent 3 days in each temple, going about from one temple to another without ever ceasing. In the second year of the same era, soldiers from the land of the Uyghurs invaded the borders of the Tang Empire. In the third year of the same era, the regional commander in the area north of the Yellow River suddenly raised a revolt. Later, the Kingdom of Tibet once more refused to obey orders from China, and the Uyghurs repeatedly seized Chinese territory. On the whole, the conflicts and uprisings were like those that prevailed at the time of the downfall of the Qin and Chu dynasties, and the towns and villages were afflicted by fire and other disasters. What was even worse, Emperor Wu Tsang carried out a vast campaign to wipe out Buddhist teachings and destroyed a great many temples and monasteries. He was never able to put down the uprisings and died shortly after. This is the essence of Jikaku's original. In view of these events, we should consider the fact that Honen was active during the reign of Emperor Gotoba around the Kenin era, 1201 to 1203. And as everyone knows, in 1221, the retired Emperor Gotoba was thwarted in his attempt to assert the authority of the throne, and he and 2 other retired emperors were forced into exile. Thus, China provided an earlier example of how Pure Land teachings brought about the fall of an emperor, and our own country offers similar proof. You should not be in doubt about the matter or consider it strange. The only thing to do now is to abandon evil ways and take up those that are good, to cut off this affliction at the source, to cut it off at the roots.
Thank you very much. So, as you know, Nichiren Daishonin said, both in this thesis and in many other gosho, that the ultimate truth must be able to satisfy the 3 proofs. That is to say, literal or documentary proof and theoretical proof, and finally, he said, most important of all, actual proof in this daily life. In the question we did in the lecture last session we had together, Nichiren Daishonin was dealing with literal or documentary proof against the Nembutsu teachings, the biggest heretical sect, as I say, in Japan at that time. And these were the very people that stirred up the authorities against him and persecuted and attacked Nichiren Daishonin from time to time. So Nichiren Daishonin, knowing this, had incredible courage, of course, and absolute conviction in his role and purpose of life in writing this thesis at all. He knew that it would bring down the strength of the authorities against him. Nevertheless, in this question and in the subsequent one, question 6, he relentlessly pursues his attempt to teach or create understanding in his opponent in the dialogue as to the ultimate truth. So this particular question is concerning rather more theoretical and actual proof in the answer to it than documentary or literal proof. So in this answer to the question number 5, Nichiren Daishonin first of all proves that the teachings of the man called Honen, who spread the Nembutsu, are in fact distorted and inferior and against the teachings of the historical Buddha Shakyamuni. And secondly, he begins to refute these teachings of Honen by theoretical proof, and then finally actual proof in the form of looking back at the history of China and Japan and various events in it. So Nichiren Daishonin's approach, as you can see, is very direct, very confident, and straight-speaking. He never flinches in his determination to achieve his aim. On the other hand, he never gets angry, and he is always courteous, even though he may be firm. He's always compassionate and confident. And these really are an example of the way we also should teach the law and react to the questions and even the anger of the people who we're talking to. To be firm, confident, courteous, never getting angry, always polite. There is no debate or dialogue that has ever occurred in the whole 700-year history of Nichiren Shoshu that hasn't resulted in a victory for the true teachings. And there have been many in that history. We all know that the teachings of Nichiren Daishonin are complete and all-embracing. Therefore, if we are patient, we can always succeed in helping people to understand, provided they're prepared to listen. And if they're not prepared to listen, there's nothing we can do about it except wait until one day they are. So this is truly the way of shakubuku. Maybe sometimes we think we could never do this ourselves, but the truth is that we can. Not so well, of course, maybe, as Nichiren Daishonin talked to this traveler here in this thesis. But shakubuku, when it's sincere, and when it's based on our compassion, our determination to open the eyes of the other person, and to help them to overcome their misery or their sufferings, then those words that we say flow directly from our Buddha state. This was the teaching of the Buddha. The words come from our Buddha state. Therefore, what have we to fear? Why shouldn't we be confident? We are doing the Buddha's work. We are the envoys of the Buddha when we shakubuku. Therefore, our words are the words of the Buddha. So, always we can do it, and never need we fear or lack confidence in our ability to do so, even though we may have only been practicing for perhaps even a month or two. Still, it's possible to give an experience of what one's understood through the practice so far and penetrate deeply to the heart of the person who's listening. So now I just want to examine 3 or 4 short passages in this particular answer which Robert read out so well. So we'll take the first passage, which is page 20, top of the right hand, almost at the top of the right hand column, and quite unforgettable in its earthiness.
The host, smiling, restrained his guest and said, "Insects that live on smartweed forget how bitter it tastes. Those who stay long in privies forget how foul the smell is."
Well, as I said, Nichiren Daishonin believed in straight speaking and in using words that would really penetrate the life of his listener. And I think these words are a good example of that. So Nichiren Daishonin, of course, is showing how easy it is for people to take religion or accept religion blindly. That is the reason, of course, for these particular words. These perverted views, which can be spread through inferior teachings, seem to become the established order. They seem almost to be common sense, yet they can't be logically justified in any way whatsoever. But still, people will accept them blindly without questioning. This is the amazing part of life and the power of religious matters. People seem to think that religion ought to be illogical and mysterious. And of course this is ridiculous. If religion is the truth of life, then it must be totally and completely and logically explainable. So this is what was behind these earthy comments at the beginning of that particular passage. Now we'll go on to another one, a little further down the same column.
But Tan Luan, Dao Chou, and Shan Dao embraced the provisional teachings and forgot about the true ones, went by what had been taught in the earlier period of the Buddha's life and discarded what was taught later. They were not the kind of men who delve into the deep places of Buddhist doctrine. Honen in particular, though he followed the practices advocated by these earlier men, was ignorant as to the source from whence they came. How do we know this? Because he lumped together all the 637 Mahayana scriptures with the 2,883 volumes of text, and along with them all the various Buddhas and Bodhisattvas and the deities of the heavenly and human worlds, and urged people to discard, close, ignore, and abandon them, offending with these four injunctions the hearts of all living beings. Thus he poured out perverted words of his own invention and took absolutely no cognizance of the explanations put forth in the Buddhist scriptures. His is the worst kind of baseless talk, a clear case of slander.
Thank you. So Honen, as you've gathered by now, was the founder of, or rather the propagator of the Nembutsu teachings in Japan. They'd begun, in fact, in China. And he founded the sect which followed the Nembutsu teachings called Jodo, or the Pure Land sect. And as you can understand from what Nichiren Daishonin said, they taught people to ignore all the teachings of Shakyamuni Buddha, including the Lotus Sutra, which Shakyamuni Buddha had said was supreme, and to concentrate only on 3 sutras which talked about the Pure Land. So, of course, Honen was slandering the Buddha in such teachings. Yet people continued to flock to him in a Buddhist land. Honen was intelligent, of course. He probably was quite a charismatic personage. And most important of all, and most influential of all, of course, he was intelligent, and therefore was able to impress the more simple people of those times. You remember in one of the previous lectures, Nichiren Daishonin explained how the monks who carried false teachings were able to impress people because of their knowledge of mundane things. The monks and the priests of those days were the most expert in such matters as building, planning cities, agriculture, and so on. And it was this that really impressed the people. But of course we see the same thing today, don't we? A person with a magnetic television personality has incredible power. and various other ways, through the written word and so on. It is possible for people to influence greatly, even though their teachings or what they're trying to put across is not necessarily sound. People become mesmerized by this. They became mesmerized by Honen, just the same as they can become mesmerized by a great television personality. So that his distorted views of the true teachings of the Buddha seem to become normal to them, a tradition. The world today is still full of cults and sects of many different sorts. Some of them, of course, there is nothing too terrible or evil about what they're doing, but there are some, perhaps one could say many still, that really are an evil influence, extorting money, spreading distorted views of life, not giving any actual proof, nor for that matter any other sort of proof of their validity. Yet people follow. The most terrible case we've seen recently, of course, was the massacre in Guyana of several hundred people following a sect based or founded in America. This is incredible, but it's true. The influence of philosophy and religion based on the completely wrong view that religion should be illogical and mysterious is colossal still, even in this technological age that we live in today. Why? Of course, the answer is that people are desperate, unhappy, miserable, bewildered by the state of the world, and therefore they'll grasp at anything, and they're open to such influences. They lose any sense of comparing one religion with another because of their desperation. They just plunge in and hang on. There is also a tendency to avoid discussion about religion. People feel out of their depth, maybe. How many cases we've had, even in the short history of Nichiren Shoshu in this country, where perhaps parents, when they first heard that their daughter or son is practicing, raised tremendous objections. Often those parents are not particularly religious at all. In fact, strange to say, the ones who usually become most agitated are the parents who are not religious, followed any religion properly. Often those who are practicing Christianity or some other religion properly and making effort in it are the most broad-minded. But the ones who don't practice feel guilty. This is why their agitation is so great. They feel when they hear their child, their son or daughter, is practicing Buddhism, which they don't understand and know very little about, that they've failed them. They feel guilty that they have not studied religion more than themselves. Or they feel agitated just out of pure ignorance of religion in a general sense. So, most of all, of course, people are totally unable to see the connection between religion and the state of a country. They think of religion as a personal and private matter, just involving inward prayer and giving some spiritual help and nothing else. But of course, the great principle of Essho Funi in Buddhism points out clearly that what is in the hearts of the people is reflected in their environment. Therefore, what is in the hearts of the people from the point of view of religion reveals itself in the environment or in the country, in the society in which they live. This is such an amazing principle that it teaches that if you are in hell, then your environment will reflect hell to you. If you're in anger, your environment will reflect anger. And if you're in Buddha, the highest state of a human being, Your environment will reflect Buddha.